The GTX 1660 Super is one of the more popular GPUs released by Nvidia, and currently it sits as the 10th most popular GPU according to the Steam hardware survey. And to be fair, for its launch price of $229, it was actually a pretty decent value. And for this price you got 1408 CUDA cores, 6GB of GDDR6 memory running through a 192-bit memory bus. So essentially it's just a regular GTX 1660, but it has GDDR6 memory instead of GDDR5. That is a GPU I did take a look at earlier in this year, which you can watch up here if you want to. The newer GDDR6 memory resulted in about a 10% performance uplift thanks to the higher memory bandwidth. And if you had one of these back in 2019, you were set for 1080p gaming and maybe even a bit of 1440p gaming as well. The model I've used for testing today is the Acer Strix Gaming, and it's one of the higher end GTX 1660 Supers, albeit this one did have a few problems. Mainly when I got it, which was fully listed in the eBay listing by the way, the fans were a bit seized up. However, I re-oiled the fans and they are working kind of fine now. They're just a bit wobbly, but the core of the graphics card, totally fine. But this Strix model's got basically every feature you would ever need. It's got RGB, a VBIOS switch, and it's got a lovely aluminium backplate as well, and not to mention a very overbuilt cooler for the 1660 Super. So will the GTX 1660 Super perform well in 2023, or will it fall flat on its face? To find out, I'll put it in my testing system and tested it at 1080p without the aid of upscaling like AMD's FSR. And the specs of my testing system are an i5 12400F, 32GB of dual rank, dual channel DDR4 memory running at 3200MHz, an MSI B660-A Pro motherboard, and a Sabrent 1TB NVMe Gen 3 SSD. I've left the 1660 Super at its stock out of the box settings, and lastly, the latest Nvidia driver has been used at the time of testing. So let's see how the 1660 Super gets on in 2023. Starting off the benchmarks today with Fortnite. I know it's very popular right now, and I did do the testing before the OG season, but performance should be relatively the same. On DirectX 12 with low settings, but I kept the high view distance and high textures, I think the 1660 Super did a pretty good job in this game. That is because on average it got 226 FPS with a 1% low of 144 frames per second. Because of this, I can firmly say a 240Hz 1080p monitor would be totally fine for Fortnite, and I think this would be a very good budget esports setup. Rainbow Six Siege is up next, and this is another esports game, and I think, yet again, the performance from the 1660 Super is totally fine. Here I set it to the medium preset to try and avoid any sort of CPU bottleneck, which is pretty hard to do in a lot of competitive titles like this. But even so, 303 FPS on average, with a 1% low of 215 FPS, doesn't sound too bad, does it? Yet again, a 240Hz 1080p monitor would be totally fine in Rainbow Six Siege, and I think the 1660 Super is putting up a decent fight in these competitive titles. With Starfield, we get struck back down to reality. That is because here, the low preset's going to have to do, and even then, 37 FPS on average with 27 FPS for the 1% low doesn't sound too good, does it? Nvidia cards do struggle in Starfield, especially ones as lower end as the 1660 Super, but even then, 37 FPS with the low preset. This isn't particularly the best gaming experience in the world, but at the end of the day, you are getting more frames than the Xbox Series X and S, albeit the quality settings are lower. Even then, I don't recommend a 1660 Super for Starfield. A game which is much more appropriate for the 1660 Super though is F123. That is because on the high preset, 85 FPS on average with a 1% low of 74 will do pretty nicely. As the 1% low is only 11 frames less than the average, this means the game ran incredibly smooth, which is always what you want in a racing game like this. If you want more frames per second, say if you've got a high refresh rate monitor, I would recommend lowering down to the medium preset and you will get a lot more frames per second with them quality settings, but overall, F123 is a great performer on the GTX 1660 Super. Next game up is God of War, and this ex-PlayStation exclusive is actually pretty well optimised on PC. Setting it to the high preset here, and on average 71 FPS with a 1% low of 59 frames per second is not bad performance by any means, especially on a graphics card as mid-range and as old as the 1660 Super. Because of this, I'd recommend just leaving it on the high preset. The game looks great, it performs great, why change that? So yeah, the 1660 Super is a very decent performer in God of War. Unsurprisingly, one of the harder games to run today is Rockstar's Red Dead Redemption 2. This did release in 2019 for the PC port, which is the same year as the GTX 1660 Super. Setting it to my middle balanced preset, which still keeps the textures on Ultra, which makes the game look absolutely incredible. The 1660 Super got 55 FPS on average with 43 FPS for the 1% low. Not particularly the best gaming experience right there, getting less than 60 frames per second on average, but I would have to say it's still very playable and it's almost double what you're getting on any console anyway, so yeah, and the game probably does look quite a bit better than, let's say, the Xbox Series S for instance. Even so, I would recommend tweaking a few settings to get above 60 frames per second in this game. Microsoft's Forza Horizon 5 is a pretty well optimised game and it does scale quite well with a wide range of hardware. Setting it to the high preset here, which still looks very good in my opinion, and the 1660 Super did a great job, getting 89 FPS on average with a 1% low of 75. This means the game looks smooth and it's also running smooth with hardly any stutters either. If you were fine with a sort of 60Hz experience, you could drop it to the Ultra preset and get prettier graphics right there, but personally I would want the extra frame rate, so I would keep it on the high preset. But either way, you've got options on PC, which is always a benefit of this platform. Horizon Zero Dawn is a game that absolutely surprised me today. That is because on the original preset, 106 FPS on average with a 1% low of 82 is great performance in my book. On the original preset, Horizon Zero Dawn doesn't look too bad in my opinion. I think if you put it onto the favor quality preset, at 1080p, you would be getting more value out of this game as it would look better and you should still get around 60 FPS in this game at least. Also, the 6GB of video memory shouldn't be a problem, as we saw with the RTX 2060 video as well. But overall, Horizon Zero Dawn performs great on a 1660 Super. Next game up is Doom Eternal. This memory intensive game does actually bring quite a few graphics cards with cut down memory configs like the 1660 Super to their knees. But today we saw pretty decent performance. That is because on the Ultra preset, the 1660 Super got 122 FPS on average with a 1% low of 94 FPS. I think this is great performance in my opinion. I wouldn't really change much with these settings as there were no massive issues at all. So I suspect most gamers out there will be fine with the Ultra preset. Maybe drop it down to high if you want more frames, but the Ultra preset is giving enough frames in my opinion. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 is one of the more disappointing games today. That is because on the basic preset with high textures, the 1660 Super only got 105 FPS on average, with a 1% low of 64 frames per second. This performance, albeit it is pretty decent in a void, that 1% low figure isn't necessarily amazing, and here I probably would recommend setting it to the minimum preset and keeping the textures on high. There you'll get some at least decent textures and you should be getting a lot more performance as well. The last game I'm taking a specific look at today is Cyberpunk 2077, and I have to say, I think the performance is pretty decent. That is because on the medium preset with the textures on high, the game does look quite decent with these settings. Also, 61 FPS on average with a 1% low of 53 FPS is not bad performance either, is it? I would recommend these settings for Cyberpunk with a 1660 Super. I don't really feel like you'll need to change these around too much, as the performance is totally fine at these settings, and I think the game looks pretty decent as well, even at this lower resolution. So these are the settings I would recommend for Cyberpunk. So taking a look at the overall data, and I think it's fair to say in the games tested today, the GTX 1660 Super still gets on pretty well if I'm honest. Even the latest AAA games, well, I'll tell a lie a bit there. Starfield didn't really perform that well, but at the end of the day, that is Starfield. Poor performance in that game is basically to be expected of any GPU around this price point. However, looking at slightly older AAA games though, like Cyberpunk, performance there was absolutely incredible. On the medium preset with high textures, so the game still does look pretty decent. Getting above 60 FPS there on average is a nice bonus, and the 1% lows were looking pretty decent as well. Even looking at games like Red Dead Redemption 2 on the middle balance preset there, I don't think the performance was too bad. Yes, it was below 60 FPS on average, but if you were to do some tweaking right there, you'd get above 60 FPS easily, and the game should still look very incredible, especially as the 6GB of VRAM is enough for the ultra textures in that game. However, taking a look at the rest of the tested games today, and we can start to see a bit of a pattern emerging. In the lightweight esports games like Fortnite and Rainbow Six Siege, frame rates of 200 plus are easily doable. And because of this, I suspect you will be finding games like Counter-Strike 2, Valorant, Rocket League, them types of games. So overall then, I think for a graphics card that cost me just £95, I don't think this is terrible performance by any means. So who is the GTX 1660 Super for? And I would have to say it's for the esports gamer who also wants to stream and record their gameplay. I say that because the 1660 Super does have the updated NVENC Turing encoder, which allows for much higher quality gameplay capture over the previous Pascal encoder. Pair this GPU with a 144Hz or even a 240Hz 1080p panel, and you're onto an esports budget winner right there. Quite literally. Where the 1660 Super also shines is it still has enough GPU horsepower to play some modernish, released in the past sort of 2 or 3 years AAA games. I say that because performance in Horizon Zero Dawn, Cyberpunk and even Red Dead Redemption 2, if you do a bit of tweaking, was totally fine. If you just want to play some chill games while you wait for your duo partner, or you just get a bit fed up with competitive games, do know that this graphics card is more than powerful enough to play some AAA games if you just want to relax. And if you mainly play older games like me, the 1660 Super is going to be totally fine at 1080p and maybe even high resolutions as well. With all that being said, that brings me on to the conclusion. For the £90 I paid for this GTX 1660 Super, I think it's not a terrible value at all. But with that being said, I do have a Vega 56 which did cost me £89, so I think that might be a bit of a GPU comparison coming up, so make sure you stay subscribed for that. But if you're aware of the GTX 1660 Super's limitations, like it won't be playing the latest AAA games at 4K maxed out with 120 frames, you're not going to be getting that on a £90 graphics card. As long as you pair your expectations with it reasonably, I think the 1660 Super is a pretty decent graphics card right now. So, with that being said, there are 2 other GPU and tech videos right up here, which might be right up your alley. And if you got this far into the video, I would like to say thank you for sticking around this long, and maybe even leave a like, or maybe even subscribe if you liked the video. With that being said, I'll catch you in the next one, and I hope you have a good day.